Brag on two guys tonight. One of them is here and one of them is not here. Philip, first of all, stepped in at the last second to lead singing. Those weren't even the songs he picked out. So thankful that Philip and other guys are willing to serve and step in. The other is Vance. Vance was supposed to lead singing tonight, but the whole youth group was at Shoals Area Youth Series, and he came here to fulfill his duty to lead singing while everyone else was at Shoals Area Youth Series. And I commend him for being willing to miss out on that to be here. But of course, we made him go there because that's where he needed to be with the youth group. So we made him go there, but it impressed me a lot that he was willing to be here to fulfill his duties. And those are just two of the good men that make up our congregation here at Chisholm Hills. If you have your Bibles, join me in Psalm 61. Psalm 61. This has been years ago, probably when I was in high school. There was a concert in my hometown or in the area of my hometown, and the headlining artists at that concert were the Oak Ridge Boys, and I was beside myself. I'd always loved the Oak Ridge Boys. I loved listening to them. I loved hearing their harmonies and the songs that they would sing, and that particular night, they sang a song that I had never heard before, and it was a song called Lead Me to That Rock. If you've ever listened to Oak Ridge Boys, you might have heard it before. If not, it's a song that I really like of theirs, and the message that's communicated in that song is very similar to the language that David uses in Psalm 61 verses 1 and 2. And after that song that night, after I heard that, of course, I was interested in the song. I liked it, but they even made a couple of statements about some events that had happened in their individual lives that contributed to their writing that song. And it reminded me a lot. Nowadays, it reminds me a lot of what David probably was going through when he wrote the song, and probably why they then chose that scripture to be the fuel for their idea for that song, Lead Me to That Rock. And so tonight, I want to revisit that song. We've probably read it or heard it before. In fact, a couple of years ago, we did the Psalms in a Bible class here, and I remember spending some time on this one. I love this psalm. It's my favorite for a couple of reasons, but tonight I want to revisit it. Because I think it might just be one that's good for us to think about and remember from time to time. Job said in Job 14:1, man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. In other words, Job says, as long as you are alive, you'll realize that you don't have to go very far, live very long before you have some sort of issue that arises. That there are those situations or times in life that you would say are painful times. David had his fair share of them. We've been looking at David in the auditorium on Wednesday nights, and we've noticed how really what the bulk of our study has been so far is David's relationship with Saul. How he looked up to Saul, and Saul was sort of a hero in some way or another in his eyes, in David's eyes, a young shepherd boy who had great aspirations, but now Saul's reign is over with, and David's sort of taking over the throne, and there was this constant struggle between he and Saul. In fact, it drove David out of Jerusalem because Saul wanted to kill him. That's one major feud in David's life that gets a lot of attention. The second major feud in David's life that gets a lot of attention is that with his son Absalom. And it's really the same situation. Absalom decides that he doesn't like the way that his dad David is ruling in Israel, and so he decides he's going to get a group of people together and he's going to rally them against his father, and he's trying to overthrow the throne so he can rule. And it forces David out of Jerusalem, because if David stays, then he's going to die. And so David flees and he gets out of town. And so there's these two major feuds, among others, that we remember about David's life. And it's very likely that David wrote Psalm 61, most would agree, when he was in a time where he was running from his son Absalom. In fact, they would say that it happened at the very end of his run from his son Absalom. Absalom is dead. That's why the language is so sorrowful. That's why the language is so real and raw, because David was in a painful time in his life. He needed something that would help him to feel better and be better, because something bad had just happened in David's life. David is headed home. He's headed back to Jerusalem to claim the throne that was rightfully his. He was heading back to his people, back to his nation. He was going to restore them, because while Absalom was running the show, there was a civil war. There was just so much that had happened in Jerusalem, and David was headed home to fix all of that, but he wasn't going home happy. He was going home knowing that he had just been through one of the most challenging and difficult times of his life. And out of those experiences come a song. In fact, the subscription above verse number 1 says, for the choir director on string, it was a song. David was pouring out his heart in a song to God, and it came from some of the most painful experiences in life. So tonight, let's notice a couple of things that David did that helped him learn some incredible lessons in the hard times of life, those difficult situations. The first thing we need to see is right here in the text, verses 1 and 2, David makes an important request. If he's going to learn from these situations, there's some things that he had to do. First thing David does is make an important request. Let's read the psalm in its entirety, and then we'll come back and focus on the first 2 verses. God, hear my cry. Pay attention to my prayer. I call to you from the ends of the earth when my heart is without strength. Lead me to a rock that is high above me. For you have been a refuge for me, a strong tower in the face of my enemy. I dwell in your tent forever and take refuge under the shelter of your wings. God, you have heard my vows. You've given heritage to those who fear your name. Add days to the king's life. May his years span many generations. May he sit enthroned before God forever. Appoint faithful love and truth to guard him. Then I will continually sing of your name, fulfilling my vows day by day. There are several verses or phrases that David makes to God that you could say are requests, but particularly I'm drawn to the first 4 verses in the psalm, namely verses 1 and 2. And what David does is really make 3 requests. The first one is right there in verse number 1. God, hear my cry and pay attention to my prayer. It's the same thing, the same idea. The psalmist does that a lot, where he'll make one statement and then give a statement that's very similar to it, just reworded idea to emphasize the real emotion or the desperation behind what he's saying. So hear my cry, pay attention to my prayer. They're the same thing. Essentially what David is asking God to do for him might be what we do sometimes. And remember from our study of Habakkuk last Sunday, what Habakkuk was doing. He was frustrated with the fact that there was no apparent answer, no apparent difference, no apparent explanation to the situation. And sometimes when that happens, we get frustrated. And we might even ask, God, are you hearing me? Are you listening to anything that I'm saying? Because there's not been an apparent change or an apparent answer. And so in this moment of like real raw emotion, David is saying, God, pay attention to me. Now, as we had mentioned before, Absalom is dead. Most everybody that writes about Psalm 61 agrees that this happened right after Absalom's death. Now, even though David and Absalom didn't have a good relationship, they did restore their relationship one time, and David forgave him, but then there was a second bad breakup, and this was after the second bad breakup. But it was said that Absalom was riding on a donkey, and his hair got caught on a limb of a tree, and then he was hanging from the limb of the tree, and Joab went and found Absalom, and against David's advice, Joab kills Absalom. 2 Samuel 18 is where all that happens. But Absalom's dead. David hears that his son is dead, and of course that just breaks him all to pieces. Even though they had a rocky relationship, even though they didn't necessarily get along, that was David's son, and David loves him. And so from a crushed position, David looks up at God and asks him, God, listen to me. Please hear me. Pay attention to what I'm asking you to do. With all of his love in his heart for Absalom, even as terrible as their relationship was, it's like in that one moment, the only thing he could think to do in the hardest time of his life, at that moment, there were other hard times, but in that moment, nothing was more difficult than losing his son, and the first thing that he thinks to do is make a request of God, namely, God, hear me. Do you ever feel like that? Where you just, the only thing you can say is, God, listen to me, pay attention to me, hear me, please. With deep confidence, you cry out. Pray with confidence because the Lord hears you. And then look at this in verse number 2. He says, I'm calling to you from the ends of the earth when my heart is faint or when it is without strength. That to me communicates another request. David is putting it out there in front of God as if to say, look, I'm without strength. I need your help. So he's asking him to hear him in verse number 1, but he's asking for his help in verse number 2 because he says, my heart is without strength. It's without any comfort or conviction. I'm down to nothing is essentially what he's asking for. And from David's perspective, notice this in verse number 2, it's as if he's at the end of the earth away from God. Where God's over here and David's over here. From David's perspective, it feels like they are as far away from each other as possible. But the interesting thing is, when David ran from Absalom the second time, when Absalom died, Absalom was in Jerusalem and David was in Mahanaim, which is just across the river. So geographically speaking, they're really close to where God is. David is, because God's presence was in the temple. David's just across the river. So geographically speaking, we're talking from here to the other side of town. It's not far at all. But from David's broken heart, it seemed like they were worlds away from each other. And so by David saying, God, my heart is faint. My heart is without strength. It's like he's saying, God, I'm so far away from you. I'm overwhelmed. My heart, it has no strength. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. God, help me. Right? But then look at this request. He says in verse number 3, rather at the end of verse 2, lead me to a rock that is high above me. Some translations say, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. The original language reads really cool to me. It says, lead me to the rock that is too high for me. And I thought that was interesting. The rock, obviously, is a picture of stability. The psalmist David and others use it all of the time. This place of stability. We sing from time to time, there stands a rock, and that rock is Jesus. We know that we can put our hope in him because it doesn't move. It stays the same all of the time. And so David uses that illustration to show, listen, I know that God, by me asking for his help and calling to him in this moment, he's as sure as he can be. That foundation is steadfast and sure, but it's that phrase, higher than I, or higher above me, or too high for me, that is interesting. David is asking God to get him somewhere that he knows he can't get on his own. Why would you ask for help in the kitchen maybe? If that, pan or cup or pot or something's on that shelf and you can't reach it, you might ask someone to come help you because you know you can't get it on your own. It's too high for you to retrieve. And David knows that. This position of recovery, this place of feeling good again. David knew he couldn't get there on his own. And so he needed God to get him to that place, a place where when the winds blow and the rains come and the storms beat on the door, they can't get you. They can't shake you. You won't move. You may stumble, you may stutter a little bit, but your foundation, it won't move at all. The sorrows of life, the difficulties of life, the struggles of life, those are really, really hard to face. But with faith, it looks to a God that can hear you, help you, and heal you. And that's what David was asking God to do in verses 1 and 2. Second thing that helped him through the hard experiences in life, he let those experiences give him understanding. Sometimes we don't really use our bad experiences. I see that a lot in basketball. Like you mess up, you have a mistake, and the kids will go and do the same mistake over and over again. It's like, man, if you would just pay attention to what you just did, or maybe even what your teammate did, then you would know you don't need to do that again. Let that bad, negative experience give you some understanding of how then you should act moving forward. That's what happens with David. Notice this in verse number 3. He says, for you have been a refuge for me, a strong tower in the face of my enemy. I want you to remember something. Remember that the first verse, David is crying out really in agony, in sorrow that the world doesn't know anything about. Because David's sorrow, the deep hurt and the pain that he's experiencing, it isn't just sorrow, and it isn't just pain, it isn't just agony. It's sorrow, pain, and agony that has faith. It knows that there's something that beats that sorrow, pain, and agony, that transcends it. There's something beyond it that means more to him. Yes, David hurts, but he hurts with hope because he knows God is on his side. He knows that God is going to make something good out of this situation. His sorrow is influenced and informed by faith, and that was important for David. But notice what he understands now. The bad experiences in his life before this experience had taught him a few things, and he had his fair share. Remember, by this time, he's already had the run-in with Saul, and he ran all over the world trying not to die. That's a bad experience. At this point, he's already had the Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. All that's in the past behind him. He's killed the lion and the bear. All of those experiences are behind David. So he's remembering back to these painful experiences in his life, and he's using them now to help him. Look what he does. First of all, he understands how his bad experiences help him to see God's provision. That's what he says in verse number 3. You have been a refuge for me. In other words, he says, God, in the past, I look back and I realized that you were my place of safety. That in those moments where I couldn't do anything and I didn't know where to go, it was you. You were the place of safety. You gave me the victory over the lion and the bear. You gave me the victory over Saul. You sheltered me and protected me and sent just the right people at just the right time so that my life could be preserved. It was you. You were my place of safety, and you did that. Every time I faced a trial, God, you provided for me. David understood that those painful experiences taught him something about God's providence. But it also taught him this in verse number 3. He says, you're a strong tower in the face of my enemy. It tells him something about God's protection in those moments. Those bad experiences taught him something about God's protection. This strong tower, it's like what we talked about a little earlier with that rock. It's elevated. It's a place where the enemy can't get. You are high above everything. It's like when I'm walking to my deer stand in the mornings in the dark. I hate walking to the deer stand in the dark. I don't know why it is. I've done it successfully without getting eaten tons of times in my life. But every time I walk away from my truck, it's hard to keep walking and not look back. It just is. And for some reason, when I get 15, 20 feet up in the air, then it's like, well, I'm safe now. No, but nothing's going to get me. A bear can climb a tree, I guess. But, it's like I'm up here, so nothing can get me anymore. When I get to that elevated position, I feel safe. Same thing with David. David's like, this God, my God, has been a place of safety, a tower, that when I'm elevated with God, I feel as if nothing can get me. I'm beyond the reach of the enemy. I heard a story one time about a kid who wanted a bigger bed. And his parents asked him, what do you mean a bigger bed? And he was like, I want one that's taller. And they asked why, and he said, because the monsters can't get up there. It's too tall for them. Just something about height that made him feel safe. He was further away from the ground, so he was safer. David says, I see that being with God gets me out of the reach of the enemy. What I'm saying is that sorrow influenced by faith, painful experiences that are coupled or married to faith, they realize that with God in the equation, there's something more, that God provides and protects. And I can use those painful experiences and remember those to give me understanding about how to handle the ones that I'll face inevitably as long as I live. Then this, number 3, and finally tonight from verse number 4. What helped David in the painful experiences? Well, to make some requests. God, I need your help. Please listen to me, that type of attitude. But then there's also this element of learning from the past experiences. But now this in verse number 4, he says, I will dwell in your tent forever and take refuge under the shelter of your wing. To me, that communicates a renewed purpose. It's like he knew what his purpose was because he was the king of Israel. But then Absalom forced him out. He had all these bad experiences where he was running from his son. But now he's headed back into Jerusalem to a war-torn place, a place that's been just ruined basically, and now he's got to put it all back together. It's like I need to refocus who I am and what I'm supposed to do. And that's what he says in verse 4. I will dwell in your tent forever and take refuge under the shelter of your wing. Here are 2 things that are communicated to me in verse number 4. Number 1, the idea of commitment. When he renewed his purpose in life, it involved commitment. That's that phrase, I will dwell in your tent forever. What he's committing himself to do is to live close to the Lord. Lord, I want to be where you are. I want to dwell where you are. Let me remain where you are. And we know, all of us in this room that have tried to live by faith know that takes a lot of commitment, doesn't it? If I want to be where God is, if I want to live where God is, if I want to be close to God and stay close to God, that takes a lot of commitment. Because if I ever stop for just a minute, or if I don't take my commitment seriously, then I find myself a lot further away from God than I want to be, and it wasn't God who moved. If I want to be close to God, it involves a great deal of commitment. And so David says, God, I want to dwell in your tent forever. That's commitment. God, I want to stay close to you. And David was serious about that, but also this idea of confidence. He says, I'll take refuge under the shelter of your wings. He had confidence knowing that God could protect him. The image of being under the wings is like that mother hen. You know, she gathers all those little chicks up, and it's like, man, they just feel confident when they're under their mom's wings. They know that they're in a place of safety. And David says, I feel that way when I'm around you. And he closes that psalm in verses 5 through 8 by expressing his confidence in God's ability to bless him in the future. Now that he has renewed his purpose and he's committed to God's cause and he's confident what God can do with him, now he starts saying in verse number 5, I'm thinking in the future now. Because of what God's done for me, I can think positively and confidently about the future. When sorrows will vanish away, when there's no troubles, and I can just walk with the Lord, and I can be everything God wants me to be. I can be everything I want to be for God. As we bring our thoughts to a close, let me encourage you. Let me encourage you to, like David, learn from those painful experiences in your life, to gain understanding from those painful experiences in your life. And what that might entail is you asking God difficult things, or admitting to God you need help by saying, God, my heart is faint. My heart is overwhelmed. My heart is without strength. Please hear my prayer, God. Help me. Heal me. I need you to lift me up to a place that I can't reach on my own. Recognize God's ability, his willingness to be your refuge and to be your strong tower. And know that with hard times comes opportunities to make strong faith. I wrote down this story that I had read some time ago in an article that was published about an eagle in their eyesight. And I want to read to you what this article said. I think it was an incredible lesson. It says that eagles, they have an extra eyelid. These eagles have extra eyelids, and when they close this extra eyelid, and what its purpose is to filter out the light. It can still see when this eyelid is closed, but it's not blinded by the light. And so they say when this eagle is being attacked by those other birds, you know, like when all the little birds get after the big birds and all that kind of stuff, or maybe there's a bigger bird of prey picking on an eagle. I'm not sure why they would do that anyway, but if an eagle's being attacked by these other birds, if they're chasing after him, what he can do is close that eyelid and he'll fly straight toward the sun. Because that eyelid filters out the light. He can still see, but he's not blinded by the light. So they say this eagle will close that eyelid and literally fly straight at the sun. And they know that the higher they go toward the sun and the closer they get to it, well, then their enemies, they can't go there because their enemies can't do that. Their enemies don't have that luxury. They fly as fast as they can to the sun. When the enemy attacks you, and he will, when the enemy is after you, you point your direction straight toward the sun. And you go as fast as you can right to him. And don't look back, because the enemy can't get you there. The enemy can't get you there. He's a high tower. He's a rock of defense, a strong, immovable foundation that hears your prayers, that listens to your cries, and that can heal even the faintest, overwhelmed, weak hearts. That's the God that we serve, the same God David knew could help him through even the most painful experiences of your life. So maybe tonight what you needed to do is be reminded that God hears your prayers. Maybe you've quit praying. I don't know why. Maybe you just think that your prayers aren't doing anything. Keep praying. He's listening. He's hearing. He's working behind the scenes. He's answering your prayers. Maybe what you needed to do is be reminded that you can actually use painful experiences to gain understanding about how to live and handle problems when they do arise in the future. Or maybe what it is just to renew your purpose in life, to work on that commitment. Maybe we could all fix that. Maybe we could all say, I want to live where God lives. I want to be close to God. And that takes an extra level of commitment. Or maybe it's just being reminded of the confidence that we can have in God's ability to be everything we need him to be and more. If you're here tonight and you need to respond to heaven's invitation, you can do so while we stand and